Activism with our guest speakers. And I'm Jane Materna. I'm with Network Nova, and I'm also on the NARAL ProChoice Virginia board. I'm going to be moderating our discussion. So welcome, welcome. I see a lot of my friends and colleagues here in Virginia that we have done a lot of work with reproductive freedom in Virginia. So welcome everyone, and thank you all so much for being here. We're the way that this is going to session is going to go is I want to talk about a few things before we go into the session, some events that are coming up, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers and presenters, and we're going to do a little bit of a conversation with them. All of you who are participating, if you'd like to put your questions in the Q&A section, I'm going to try to look at those Q&As as we're having a conversation and ask your questions as we kind of have a dialogue. And then at the end, we're also going to open it up to free questions, questions that may be broader or different than what we talked about. And I'll either take those from the Q&A. We will also try to, at the end of the session, use Zoom and see if some of our participants actually want to ask that question, audio, verbally. We'll try to use our Zoom technology to allow you to do that. So that's my plan for this session. Now, I do just want to mention that this session is a collaboration between Network Nova, which is a Virginia grassroots group, and NARAL ProChoice Virginia. And we have a couple upcoming events that I also want to bring to your attention. One is our Network Nova Summit, and I'm going to put in the chat section the links for these events. And then there is going to be somewhat of a follow-up discussion or a different kind of discussion. We're going to do a book discussion with NARAL ProChoice Virginia, and that is going to be on July 22nd. And we are going to be reading Annie Finch's Choice Words and having a book discussion about that. So all of you who are participating now, please feel free to sign up and join that. So I'm looking around and I have lost my chat. Oh, here's the chat. Okay, I want to put these links in for our attendees so you have this information. And I may not be able to, see. Okay, it looks like because of how we're doing this as a webinar, I'm not able to input those links into the Q&A, but for our guests, please just be aware of that.
Jane, I will put them in.
Thank you so much, Stair. Stair Calhoun from Network Nova is helping us put together this session, as well as one of our leaders in the Women's Summit. So thank you all very much. Okay, let's see. Okay. Got the grants. Okay. So it is now my pleasure to invite our two guests. And we have two just amazing women to speak with today around reproductive freedom. And I want to take a minute to thank one of our Network Nova colleagues, Bernice Laresh, who actually introduced us to Annie and Ashley. And without her making that introduction, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation, be able to develop these relationships. And it's so important in the work that we're doing as activists. We really do a lot of networking and connecting with each other. And I really appreciate that Bernice and so many of all of my participants that are here, and Annie and Ashley for being willing to connect with each other and have conversations and work on this really hard work together. So I would like to begin by introducing Annie Finch. Annie is an award-winning feminist poet. She has written 7 books of poetry and has received the 2012 Saraswati Award from ASWM. So she's an award-winning poet. One of her recent works, she is the editor of Choice Words, which is Writers on Abortion. Her poetry has been performed at Carnegie Hall and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, installed in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and published in Poetry, the Paris Review. I am delighted to have met Annie and to talk with her primarily about her book, Choice Words, but also delighted to find out that she collaborates with artists in dance and theater and music and all these wonderful performing arts, and so excited to have you with us. And Annie is actually local to us in here in Virginia. She is from Washington, D.C. Annie, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I think everyone who's involved in this sort of activist work is just a shero, and I'm just very honored to be able to speak with you all today.
Perfect. I'm going to take a minute to introduce our next panelist, Ms. Ashley Jordan. Ashley is a feminist writer, activist, and organizer, and a licensed attorney. She has taught gender and women's studies courses at Northern Illinois University in Illinois, and researched and written extensively on issues of feminism and gender equality. Her articles have been published in Ms. Magazine and the Huffington Post, to name a few. She is also the founder of Women Activists, a women's rights activism group in Wisconsin, and the feminist blog Fashion Forward Feminist. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Network Nova and NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Annie.
So Annie, I've already mentioned that you have written this or edited the book Choice Words, and I'd love for you to tell us what made you decide to compile all of these works of writings on abortion, and tell us the story of how the book got written.
Well, I'm a poet and I love literature, so that's how I really relate to the world. And I'm used to, understanding great experiences that happen in life. Love and death and the changing of the seasons. These wonderful big topics through literature, through poetry, through stories. And there was a time in my life when I had an abortion. I was the mother of 2 children, and the youngest was 1 year old. And I got pregnant again, and it was not right. I really thought it through very carefully. My family and I thought it through. I had an abortion. And it was a very peaceful and good experience, but I had a lot of trouble processing this experience. I was completely pro-choice. I believed in it all, and but I felt just a lot of anger at my husband and a lot of grief and bitterness, and it was really difficult for me. So it was during this period that I began to look for writing about abortion, and I discovered that there really wasn't much. In fact, hardly any at all. And I began wondering, is it possible that people haven't written about this incredibly important experience? I mean, there were like a few things that some people might know about the Cider House Rules, or Hemingway has this story about it, Hills Like White Elephants, but they're kind of like nasty stories. They weren't about the experience of abortion. They were more about some guy deciding that the world is terrible because women have abortions. It just didn't, and it wasn't helpful. And I just like, where are the voices of about this experience? I couldn't find them. So that's when I started thinking about it. And then to tell the end of the other story, after about almost like 8 or 9 months of this deep emotional turmoil about it, I just realized one morning, I woke up and I thought, I need like a ritual. I need some kind of like closing, not just for myself, but for my whole family. And I realized the issue was that I had the abortion not as an individual person, but I had the abortion as something for my family, which was my community, really, for the good of my whole family. But I was carrying it alone, as if I was alone with it, and that was the hardest part. So I told my husband about it. My husband and my kids and I went into the woods, and we created this beautiful ritual where we said goodbye to the baby, and the kids made little pictures, and this wonderful deer came and stood next to us in the forest. And so it ended, and that amazingly enough, the day after that ritual, I woke up and I felt completely happy and calm and at peace about the entire abortion experience. And I'm sharing this here because I just think it's really important to tell these kinds of stories. And that was it. I mean, it's never been a trouble to me ever since for 20 years, never been an issue. So that gave me a sense of the power of not only literature, but also ritual, right? And so when I put this book together, it took me 20 years to put it together. I searched for the kinds of writing and creative, verbal creation that people had used to communicate their experience about abortion, and also to help to transform their experience about abortion. So there are rituals in here as well, like the one that I did, and there's actually a section from a book that I wrote about that experience. And there are a lot of women's writings about their abortion experiences, about friends of theirs, and they come from all perspectives, whether it's telling the story or the emotions or creating some kind of a ritual or a political, just the will for reproductive freedom and how important that is to our humanity as women.
Yeah,
Many
so
different
Annie, I have my book, and you'll notice that I have been diving in. And so Ashley, it's my understanding, now, did you and Annie meet through Choice Words? And tell me about how you connected with Annie.
Sure. So Annie and I actually met as a result of my Huffington Post article. Annie found me, and I'm so glad she did. And she reached out and told me that Choice Words was coming out in a couple months, and asked if I had any ideas as to how we could use the book to bring women together and build feminist community around the incredible literature and Choice Words. So that's kind of how we met, and our friendship and partnership started, and that led to the creation of Choice Words Action, choicewordsaction.org, which is a website that we created to channel the amazing literature and choice words and turn that into concrete action and activism. So we have a comprehensive toolkit for holding events around choice words, whether it be feminist book clubs or a book drive for a local clinic, or even a yoga session. We have a number of about 9 to 10 steps for planning your choice words event, as well as a discussion guide with a thorough discussion, or with numerous questions around the literature and choice words. So Annie found me, and I'm so glad she did. It's an honor to work with her to use this book to build feminist community.
So is there, Annie or Ashley, is there a particular story either in Choice Words or that you've read that you've used for your activism?
Well, I have, one thing I love to do is to share poetry at gatherings, political gatherings. And I just think it's so inspiring when you get people together. And so there are some pieces that I have really enjoyed sharing at events in honor of women's autonomy, reproductive autonomy. There's a wonderful one by Marge Piercy, which I will share. And the book is actually organized around different ways that we relate to abortion. So there's a section about heart, about mind, making the decision. And so right now I'm looking at the section on will, where you have some really inspiring pieces for political action. But Marge Piercy's poem, Right to Life, for example, she begins, "A woman is not a pear tree thrusting her fruit in mindless fecundity into the world. Even pear trees bear heavily one year and rest and grow the next. An orchard gone wild drops few warm, rotting fruit in the grass, but the trees stretch high and wiry, gifting the birds 40 feet up. A woman is not a basket you place your buns in to keep them warm, not a broad hen you can slip the duck eggs under. We are all born of women. In the rows of the womb, we suckled our mother's blood, and every baby born has a right to love like a seedling to sun. A decade downstream, when a child is born unloved, a child screams, a woman falls. I will choose what enters me, what becomes flesh of my flesh. Without choice, no politics, no ethics, lives. I am not your cornfield, not your uranium mine, not your calf for fattening, not your cow for milking. You may not use me as your factory. Priests and legislators do not hold shares in my womb or my mind. This is my body. If I give it to you, I want it back. My life is a non-negotiable demand.
Thank you, Annie. And I've noticed reading your works and up on you, and one of the phrases that I've heard in the activism that you're creating around this book and the work you do is the concept of abortion without apology. And in the reproductive freedom movement, we are also trying to destigmatize abortion. The term is such a loaded term, and how it's used. And so, but be able to do that, it takes a deeper dive into these things. I think the literature and reading about it in many, either in poetry or in a narrative, in stories, I think it helps us process our own experiences and the broader experiences in the world. So, one of the reasons for having this conversation is to talk about, how do we use the written word, for our activism? And so thank you for sharing that poem. Ashley, you've written an article talking about a term that's birthright.
Mm-hmm.
Could you expand upon that a little bit and tell us about your article and what you were saying in it?
Sure. So in an article that I published with Ms. Magazine entitled "Our Bodies Are Hell, How Modern American Sexism Weaponizes Women's Bodies," I wrote that if women do not even have agency over the physical frameworks of ourselves, we have nothing, let alone social, economic, and political power. This basic human right should not be a request our government grants us or a social privilege bestowed upon us, but a birthright. And what I mean here is that at its most basic level, having complete physical autonomy and control over our own bodies should not be a topic of political debate or a news soundbite, but something that we are all entitled to by the very virtue of our own birth and humanity.
Yeah. I think so. The terms like birthright and destigmatism, I think these terms are important, and I think having these terms and concepts helps us in our activism.
Yeah.
Reading things have sometimes moved me to take action. There was an article that Aaron Matson wrote before the 2017 gubernatorial primary in Virginia. And it really spoke to me, and it actually drove me to action. And so, I would like to know, Ashley or Annie, if, in your work as an activist, has there been a story or some kind of writing that has influenced you or motivated you to take a particular action or go in a certain direction?
Well, for me, Soraya Chemaly's 2018 book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, has really been a driving force behind my own activism in recent years. The book begins with Chemaly painting this really powerful image of her mother standing in her backyard, throwing pieces of her wedding china and shattering them one by one. And that imagery really resonated with me because it symbolized the repressed anger that so many of us as women feel. You know, in our culture, we are conditioned to suppress anger. Anger is considered a masculine emotion, and you know, we've all been told to smile more, and you know, women who appear too angry, you know, are called names, and most of them are not very kind, to say the least. But Shamali's book really highlights that anger is such a powerful emotion when it comes to fueling and driving social change. So it's interesting that at the same time that we're forced to exist as second-class citizens in American culture, you know, without even the right to control our own reproduction or constitutional equality, we are taught that we shouldn't be angry, let alone express anger. So Molly's point that when we suppress our anger, we're really disempowered. You know, women's anger historically has fueled social movements and historical change. So women should be angry. And I think after the last presidential election, many of us were angry, and that's how we ended up here. I know for me, that's how I ended up here. So, you know, we need to channel that righteous anger into continued activism, because one quote from the book that is kind of my mantra is that angry women burn brighter than the sun. And I think that that's really true. And we're seeing the effects of that in terms of social change and elections, but we need to continue to be angry. We should be angry, and rather than suppress that anger, we need to use it to continue to drive for social change, especially in the area of reproductive freedom.
And I can say that
I see you opening your book, so.
Yeah, I just want to say editing this book really made me, I think editing this book, putting together and living with it for 20 years has really inspired my activism, and in a subtler way, because I'm a literary person, I'm a writer, and I'm probably more active in spiritual circles than like politically per se. But living with this book has made me so deeply activist in the sense that it's helped me understand that women's voices and women talking to one another are essential. And it's filled me with rage to feel that the conversation about abortion, which is the most private, powerful exercise really of our power as women, I mean, that choice is so at the core of us, and that the political sphere under patriarchy thinks that it can set limits and decide when this thing is right or wrong. I mean, who the hell are they? It just infuriates me. And when this chorus of all the different voices in this book, was it 140 different contributors, each telling their own story, and what really strikes me is that each story is so completely different that it just fills me with awe and respect and complete just like admiration for every single woman who makes a choice of any kind. And you know, how dare anyone think that they have the right to make some generalization? I mean, it's an outrage. And you know, some of the themes that came out for me putting this together: abortion is normal, right? It's completely normal. There is no way to do it. Feelings about an abortion can evolve. Feelings about an abortion can be negative, which is why I like to talk about the fact that, you know, even though I'm a million% pro-choice, it's not to say that my abortion was necessarily like, okay, la-di-da, it's over, no big deal. I know for lots of people it is. And in this book, there are stories of people for whom it's like nothing. And people who go out and celebrate with a pastrami sandwich, and other people who get really, really depressed and they have to live with something, often a secret that they can't tell, that they can't share for so long. And, you know, the range of experiences is so great. But what it
There's
probably
one
makes
story,
me feel is that it's
there's one
important that
story that really mixes both of those. And so it's a story of the woman who knew she had to have an abortion, but when she went into the clinic, she actually told the clinic staff to hold her down. The way the story is written, she knew she had to have an abortion. She wanted the abortion. It was the right thing to do, but she knew her body might actually be conflicted in it. And so it's an amazing story because, making the decision about these things, it's a real decision. It's not a la-di-da-di thing. Yeah. And sometimes things aren't, well, very often things are not black and white. And that's, the complexity of these decisions doesn't make them wrong.
Right.
There's that one story in the book of a woman who chose to do it, and she knew physically her body just may be against.
I think that's Caitlin McDonald, maybe, the abortion I didn't want. Yeah. And then there are many pieces in here by women from cultures where they're being forced to have abortions they don't want. In India, that's a huge problem. They abort the girls because they prefer boys. So these women are aborting their daughters, and that's just tragic. And so it's a total spectrum. But I think it just comes back to this. For me, just the activism that inspires in me is a desire now, very passionate desire to get women together and to get women talking to each other at all costs. And I almost feel like if we can actually achieve that, like create real communication among women, everything else will just fall into place. I have so much respect and honor for women and the way we work and the way we work together and the way we have a way of just putting all the information out there and then together figuring out the best way. I mean, it just seems like that is a kind of a magic. And anything I can do now to bring women together. So I'm teaching online and I'm putting together like women's retreats. And I just feel that working with this material and with this book and realizing the toll that silence takes on women, and the connection, of course, between silence and shame and abortion and maybe not having spiritual control over our lives.
Amy, how many, looking at your background, you're talking about building community, and this is one of the things I wanted to ask, during this session. You've developed a book club discussion around choice words. Yeah. And are you finding that women are doing book discussions, and what kinds of experiences are they having with that?
That's a really good question. I think yours may be like the first one.
Oh.
That's actually, that's getting together and using this book discussion guide the way it was designed. So, we're hoping it'll catch on and that they'll be all over the place. I think, I don't know. Ashley, do you know another one yet?
Mine.
Yes, and actually, over to you. Tell us about the activist group
an abortion
started and how that came about.
Sorry, Jane, what was I missed your question.
I apologize, Amy.
No, that's okay.
We got excited here. So the book club, I think that's a good segue actually to talking about your women's group, Women's Activists in Wisconsin. Can you tell us a little about how you founded that book, the group, and tell us if you're reading and how you might be using choice words or other works, to build the book. But tell us about your group.
Sure. So I came home from the 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C., back to my home here in southeastern Wisconsin. And the march really lit a fire in me, and I didn't want it to end there. So I hadn't lived in my conservative community for very long, and I didn't know many people, certainly not like-minded people, but I reached out to a handful of women who were only suspected feminists, not confirmed. And here that means about an 80% likelihood they will not speak to you again if they're not like-minded. But I took the chance.
We're familiar with that, although we get spoken to a lot more, actually.
But I took the chance. And so Women Activists was really born with a group of 5 women around my kitchen table initially. And we graduated to a local wine bar basement and became a bit of a feminist underground here, literally and figuratively. But now we have, over the last few years, we've multiplied. We participate in everything from organizing political demonstrations and protests to campaign fundraising and legislative lobbying. And we run a feminist book club, which is where we'll be hosting a Choice Words book event in September with Annie and some of the other wonderful contributors to Choice Words. And in terms of using that event for activism, my intention is to use that event to connect pro-choice organizations and pro-choice people across the state. So we're going to be working with everyone from Planned Parenthood Wisconsin to POWERS Wisconsin, which stands for Pregnancy Options, Resources, Support, and Education, and really using the book as a mechanism to connect these pro-choice organizations, do some fundraising, and discuss the literature and choice words. Because I think, as Annie pointed out, what I found so powerful about this incredible book is that it really does highlight the depth of the abortion experiences, the diversity of abortion experiences. And for me, as someone who's never had an abortion, even as a pro-choice person and activist, it gave me a deeper perspective and understanding of abortion experiences, and really drove home why it's so important that the choice whether to have an abortion remain an individual choice.
Yeah, so I hear, this idea of bringing women together and having real conversations, collaborating, and deciding to act together. I think there's real power in that. And I think that's what we're trying to, grab hold of and harness. You talked about righteous anger. If we can do this as a group, as a collaboration, or in collaborations with other, with other groups, and build upon that, that's where our real power and strength, I think, moves. It allows us to take action. I'm looking for the word, so hopefully maybe I need to read a little bit more in the literature. There's a couple questions that have come up from our participants, and thank you all so much for being here and for bringing those questions in. So I'm going to ask one of them, and I'll read it. So, recent events have made me more sensitive to potential racial aspects to issues. Is the experience of women of color around abortion different than that of affluent white women? What do you, Annie and Ashley, find about voices of women of color on the abortion experience?
Thank you. Yeah. Ashley, were you going to say something?
Oh, go ahead, Annie. I'll build off of.
I want to say that actually, I'm so glad that question came up, because it was actually two African-American women's poems that really inspired me to start the book. Because when I was looking for literature, there's a fantastic poem by Gwendolyn Brooks and another by Lucille Clifton, which really stood out as early examples of really frank, honest, beautiful, moving poems about abortion by mothers of other children, which is another thing that Katha Pollitt wrote a foreword to the book, and she points out that that African-American women have really been very upfront and compared to white women earlier on about this experience and about the way that it is an act of love. Not everyone who's African American writes about it in that way, but I think that's a perspective of the strong woman who's already a mother who makes this choice out of love that comes forward very much in these great poems by Gwendolyn Brooks and Lucille Clifton. And I just want to read a little bit from the Gwendolyn Brooks poem. It's such a wonderful, wonderful poem, and her poem is often misunderstood as being an anti-abortion poem. And in fact, when I wanted to use the poem for the book, I had to write to Gwendolyn Brooks' estate, and they asked me what the book was like that it was going to be in, and they had to find out where it would appear before they would give permission. And I think that's because it is sometimes used the other way, because it's very honest about the emotions but it has a very famous first line that maybe some people will recognize: abortions will not let you forget. You remember the children you got that you did not get, the damp small pumps with a little or with no hair, the singers and workers that never handled the air. You will never neglect or beat them or silence or buy with a sweet. You will never wind up the sucking thumb or scuttle off ghosts that come. You will never leave them controlling your luscious sigh, return for a snack of them with gobbling mother eye. And then it ends, believe me, I loved you all. Believe me, I knew you, though faintly, and I loved you all. So, you know, maybe the greatest piece of literature written about abortion in the U.S. It's an amazingly wonderful poem. And then throughout the book, I would say women of color, particularly African-American women, are some of the strongest and most memorable pieces. Audre Lorde, there's an excerpt from her memoir, Zami, where she describes being as a high school student, I believe, having an abortion just at a very young age on her own, completely. And there's one ally, one teacher who's supporting her, but so moving. Ntozake Shange's piece For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, probably the climax of that very important play. So these were early, you know, kind of, they were up front. They were kind of the leaders in the literary sense in this kind of literature, I feel. And the experiences that come out are, you know, are definitely varied, but it's clear how racism comes into it and how, you know, the extra burdens of social injustice. And
So Annie,
Maya's poem is especially wonderful that way by the poet.
yeah, thank you. So Annie, there's a kind of a follow-on question, and Ashley, feel free to chime in on this. So on intersectionality, people of color prioritize racism, while women prioritize sexism centered on reproductive rights. It seems to the exclusion of other concerns. So, let me make sure I've said that correctly. So they're saying that people of color prioritize racism and women prioritize sexism centered on reproductive rights. It seems to the inclusion of other concerns. So what advice do you have in bridging this gap to work together? So perhaps, I think when they're saying maybe white women prioritize sexism, and feel free to edit in my comments here if I haven't interpreted this correctly, but I think the question is around people of color prioritizing racism and the intersectionality of being a woman, being a woman of color. How do we bridge, you know, perhaps between white women and women of color on these issues of reproductive freedom?
Well, I think, Jane, that the first thing that we need to do is be very upfront about the fact that women of color, immigrant women, are some of the most oppressed when it comes to reproductive rights and access, rural women as well. But women of color are also victimized not just by, you know, anti-choice legislation and abortion access, but also by healthcare. You know, women of color have much higher maternal mortality rates than white women. And so we need to be aware of the fact that the barriers to access for women of color are substantially higher than that, especially for, you know, fairly, you know, white women like myself and all of us here. And I think that the other thing that we need to do is do a better job of being aware and honest in discussing that fact and bringing more attention to the fact that when we talk about reproductive rights and access, that we are not all treated equally in that respect. We do not have equal access. And so we need to do a better job, I think, as reproductive justice activists and advocates of amplifying the voices of women of color to help us understand how we can start to bridge that gap and improve access for those women.
Yeah, and I think the term even, the pro-choice, pro-life terms are things that the reproductive justice, reproductive freedom, we're actually in the movement trying to move away from the term choice. Because it's so well understood in some ways, and so also, but the term we're trying to move away because of these issues of racism and in economic status, that many women don't have a choice. There's actually not a real choice or access to safe, legal abortion care, depending on where they are or their own status. So the term choice is a problem when it comes to intersectionality and trying to bridge, white women, you've heard it, can always access, not always, but affluent white women, it's much easier for them to access reproductive health care, including abortion care, than it is if you're a person of color, or if you're an immigrant, you don't have status, and so on and so forth. So choice is not a real, it's not a real term. It's not real for many women.
Absolutely.
So I've got a couple other questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask them here. Sure, move on. Okay. So one of our participants is asking, she is actually an aspiring writer in the young adult genre, and she would like to know what are some ways you'd like to see young adult writers destigmatize abortion and the discussion of reproductive rights for teenage readers. So Annie or Ashley, do you have any advice?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm actually just planning in the fall to start teaching an abortion writing workshop with a friend of mine who's a writer and a therapist, because I just think it's, for a lot of people, it's a way to process their own experience, but to take it a step further and begin to write for an audience that really needs to hear about it in that way is very exciting. I would think that awareness of the larger social context around abortion would be really helpful for teen readers, because it's so often presented like just, a personal individual thing. And one aspect that I really noticed in this book, in Choice Words, putting it together, was how many of the stories involve a supportive figure. Like that, whether it's a mother, a daughter, Ursula Le Guin has a great one about a mother and a daughter, or there's a midwife in this excerpt from a piece by Ruth Parajabala. There are just, or a doctor or a nurse, a friend. There needs to be often support. And that's something we don't hear about. We think about it as sort of this isolated experience. So I would say to really consider exploring the network of support that women can give each other around this experience, and how important that is to find those supportive people, whoever they are, who will see you through it, who will accept you through whatever you need to deal with. And also the political awareness, the awareness of exactly the kinds of things we've been talking about, the effect of race, the effect of religion, the effect of geography and culture, and in the ways that these larger forces are impacting that teenager, so that the teenager is not just having her own little issue, but she can see it as part of a big fabric that's affecting her, and realize it's really not her fault, and it's not her individual problem. If it's a problem, it's something that she has help dealing with, or can look for help, and maybe model that looking for help and support, and that political consciousness, and then maybe even the activism that might come after that. That would be nice.
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's amazing advice, Annie. You and I have talked. Your book has the different sections in it on body and spirit, and how you've that's mind, body, heart, will, and spirit. And you and I have talked about that my categories that I'm working with, a framework, are political, medical, religious, and legislative. And so I think that speaks to your advice, and that putting abortion in the context of an individual's life and how it's actually a decision that affects or is part of, you know, the people around her and even the society at large. So, and that's golden, right? I mean, I think that's something that really will fuel our activism and that understanding.
It's so important because it just feels to me that women, you know, and I don't want to be too general, and you know, I know essentialism is a danger, but in my experience, women are really great at connecting and feeling, you know, part of a bigger whole together. And so it just seems like such a ridiculous and cruel irony that under patriarchy, women are more separated from each other than men are often, and, you know, not able to make these larger networks and connections and ways of thinking of ourselves as part of something bigger, which is, you know, it's just ironic in a bad way.
And I want to add to your points that have been raised about the importance of considering and including the larger cultural context in writing about abortion. You know, I know from my own experience, and something that I've written about is, you know, I've never had an abortion, but I did have a pregnancy scare in college. And I thought I was going for a while that I was going to be faced with the question of whether or not to have an abortion. And looking back on that experience, what I realized is that even though I was raised in a pro-choice household and that I've been a lifelong reproductive justice advocate, looking back, I believe I would have chosen pregnancy over myself, and not because it's what I wanted, but because growing up in the 90s when abortion was supposed to be, you know, even among pro-choice people, right, safe, legal, and rare.
Yeah.
Rare made it sound like it was only, you know, sanctioned in the most extreme cases, as if it wasn't enough for a woman to say that pregnancy wasn't part of her life plan in that moment, as if choosing herself over pregnancy wasn't good enough to justify the choice. And so I think I would have succumbed to stigma. And I think that, you know, anti-choice rhetoric has been so loud, it's almost ear piercing at times, especially in areas of the country like mine. And I think until we really, you know, I think it's not as important how you write about abortion and speak about abortion as it is that you write and speak about abortion. You know, speak out, speak up. We need to create a culture of abortion without apology and abortion without equivocation or excuse. And I think part of changing the conversation really means more people writing about it, more people speaking up about it. I wish I'd grown up with louder voices, stronger voices saying that abortion wasn't just a choice available to me, but a choice that was okay for me. And I think until we have that, women in this country or pregnant people will never be truly free. The choice will never truly be ours because stigma robs a lot of us of a true choice.
Yeah.
And actually one of our questions that came in from Francesca, I think you've answered that, but I'm going to ask it just so you know. So she thanks us for having this important and empowering collection of affirming and destigmatizing voices on abortion. And she asked, have you found there are words and ways to talk about, to talk to the mainstream about abortion? And I think, you know, Ashley, what you're saying, the point is we just need to talk about it more. It needs to be in the common language. And I want to add to that. And so I think Susan, a friend of mine, is one of our participants as well. And she had asked me about this book when I mentioned this session. And the idea was that Choice Words, was this a book of stories of women having abortions? And even the stigma of, well, you know, who really wants to read a book about women having abortions? That doesn't sound like an interesting something I don't want to do. And the book is not that. It's the context, you know, of these decisions and what it's about. So, you know, the more we talk about it as just this is something that happens and that decisions are made and choices, it's a part of a woman's life. And so to, you know, right off the top, you know, if you want to call it, the pro-lifers say it's wrong, it's destigmatized, it's an integral part of a human being's life.
Mhm.
So you automatically set up this, you know, hatred with your own self. It's just, it's, anyway, so I'm going off on a tangent here, and I apologize. I'll come back again.
I think it is very, can I just say something, Jane?
Yes, please.
You know, there is another book that came out a year, well, there's a couple of books. There's one called I Had an Abortion, and then there's one came out, I think, a year or two ago called, is it Shout Your Abortion? And these are really stories of women having abortions, like that's what they are. But this book is actually not that. This book is great literature, like great writers. I mean, we've got Amy Tan, Audre Lorde, Dorothy Parker, Gloria Steinem, Gwendolyn Brooks, Joyce Carol Oates, Lucille Clifton, Langston Hughes, Lindy West, Margaret Atwood, you know, great writers, Ursula K. Le Guin. So this is like, it's not just, you know, about the subject matter, it's about how these great writers who, you know, who think about life and death and how they have written about abortion. So what you're getting in here is you are getting the experience of abortion through the lens of like some of the greatest minds that have ever written literature. So it's, you know, each one is a gem, and each one is completely different from the other one, and the range of cultures and centuries and, you know, just perspectives is just amazing. You have like this Nobel Prize winning novel from China about a woman who, as she throws herself in the river because they want her to like abort her baby because they have the 2-baby rule. And then, you know, you go from that to like the medieval times, and there's this woman who's like riding out, and her maid tells her that there's an herb in the wood, and she goes riding out on her horse and picks this herb so she can have an abortion. This is like 600 years ago. I mean, just, you know, whole ranges. Or in India, like someone going to the midwife and having this beautiful experience with like the midwife, like they do it through pressure on the belly. And then you have like these women in Australia having this whole circle of women like praying for the women who don't have reproductive freedom. And then you have women in like South America talking about what it's like, you know, when it's like hush hush and you have to go to this dangerous place under the bridge. And you have this woman in Poland who, you know, in 1930 in Poland, what it was like for her. And I mean, it's just amazing. So, you know, it's not just, oh yeah, abortion. They're all like, it's amazing. I mean, it turns out it is like one of the great subjects of literature. I mean, it combines life and death and spirituality and humanity, and it's universal, but it's completely unique. I mean, it's kind of awe-inspiring.
It's so beautiful, Annie. It's so beautiful. Thank you. Well, sadly, we're coming close to the end of our time, and so I wanted to give both you, Ashley, and Annie a chance to say anything that you would like to say before we close out. I think I've gone through the questions that our participants have put in. If anyone would like to add another question, I'd be happy to try to look through that real quick here. Let me see. Checking through, but I think in the few minutes that we, just a couple of minutes, if Ashley or Annie, you know, we've kind of jumped around a little bit, and this was just a taste of the amazing work that both of you are doing and your insights. If you'd like to leave us with a little nugget, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. Since we're talking about the power of the written word and reproductive freedom activism, I'll just leave you with a few words from two of the pieces that I've written to try to channel the power of the written word and reproductive freedom activism. But I want to also thank you all for your time today. And in closing, I just want to wish you all a future and wish our bodies no longer subject us to a gendered hell, but where we may at last fully reclaim them for ourselves. May you use literature to speak truth to power, to give new life to the feminist fight for reproductive liberty, and to give new voice to choice.
Thank you, Ashley. Annie?
Well, I will close with a line from a poem. Women have voices it's time to believe in. Brave women's words spoken out, clear and steady, move us with generous ways of achieving. Women have voices. It's time to believe in brave women's words spoken out, clear and steady.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Miss Annie Finch and Miss Ashley Jordan. Thank you so much for joining us today, for using the written word for reproductive justice. It's been a delight and a pleasure, and thank you to all of our participants. If you have any questions for Annie or Ashley, please feel free to email Network Nova or myself, and we'll put you in contact with them. I did publish their information in the past, but we'd love to stay in contact with all of you all. And thank you all once again for being here today. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks, Annie.
Thanks, Ashley. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everyone, for choice.
Yes.
And if you get the book, they give you these really cool buttons and stickers.